Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Christians and non-Christians, Orthodox and Catholics, and other denominations. Today we will deal with why the Roman Catholic dogma about the Pope's infallibility and authority is incorrect and unbiblical. In this video, we will objectively analyze the verses from the Holy Scriptures and the history of the Church, as well as the events within it through the ages, and we will use simple deduction and logic during this analysis. Let's get started then, shall we? The Roman Catholic Church is not the same church as the Catholic Church. The term Catholic, in the Greek language the word Katholikos, literally means universal or general. The Catholic Church was founded by Jesus Christ around 33 AD. Its official beginning was on the Feast of Pentecost in Jerusalem. The Church by its nature is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. During the first 1000 years, there was one unified church that defined the fundamental or Christian dogmas at the 7 ecumenical councils. There were 5 main centers, the Pentarchy. Those are 5 great patriarchies that held the highest prestige and authority. Those are Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. The supreme authority was not a single individual, but the ecumenical council, a gathering of all the bishops in the world. We will talk about the ecumenical councils in more detail later. The Church used 2 languages in 2 different regions. The East used the Greek, while the West used the Latin. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, held a special status. He was considered first among equals, in Latin, primus inter pares. He held a primacy of honor because Rome was the capital of the empire and place where apostles Peter and Paul were martyred, but was equal to other patriarchs in terms of his sacramental and episcopal rank. They were all bishops. He didn't have authority over ecumenical councils. The basic 3-level hierarchy was consolidated already by the middle of the 2nd century and became universal. The structure was made up of bishops, priests, and deacons. Bishops were considered the successors of the apostles and were the only ones with the authority to ordain other priests. A priest is an elder who led local liturgies and took care of the spiritual life of the community under the authority of the bishop. A deacon is an assistant who served the bishop and presbyter, engaged in social work, and helped during worship. As the Church expanded within the Roman Empire, new titles were created for easier management, such as Metropolitan, which is the bishop or capital of a Roman province, and Archbishop, which is an honorary title for bishops of larger centers. There is no higher rank than bishop. A patriarch, pope, metropolitan, and or archbishop are still just bishops in their priestly rank. Even the Roman Pope or the Ecumenical Patriarch actually bear the title Bishop of Rome or Bishop of Constantinople. The only difference between a priest and a bishop is that a priest cannot ordain new priests, everything else is the same. He can baptize, he can marry, he can serve the liturgy. A priest cannot proclaim himself a bishop, nor is he elected solely by the people. The bishop is elected by the council of bishops to determine who is the most worthy of that office. This way, it's avoided that dubious teachers can ordain their own priests and spread heresy, and that bishops are direct successors of the apostles. Later, it was introduced that a bishop must be celibate in practice. The church structure has been maintained by the Orthodox churches to this day. The early Roman Church was one of the 5 patriarchates founded by apostles Peter and Paul in Rome around 1042-67 AD. The Roman Catholic Church, post 1054 AD, is a separate, centralized institution that emerged after the Great Schism. The Rome broke communion with the other four patriarchates and claimed supreme authority over the entire Christian world. The defining feature of the Roman Catholic Church is the role of Pope. He is the Bishop of Rome and the supreme head of the Church. Roman Catholics believe he is the Vicar of Christ and the successor of Saint Peter. Papal infallibility is a dogma invented in 1870. It states that the Pope is preserved from error only when he speaks ex cathedra, which means from the chair. The administrative center is in Vatican, that is independent city-state, and also the smallest country in the world. The church operates under a strict pyramidal structure. Certain ranks have similar meanings, but there are also special ranks. More precisely, the differences in the ranks of the Roman Catholic Church differ from the structure of the early church. For example, the Pope himself has complete authority here and is above other bishops. There are priests, they manage local communities called parishes. In the Roman Rite, priests must practice clerical celibacy. Bishops, they oversee geographical areas called dioceses. Cardinals are high-ranking prelates who advise the Pope. They also elect a new Pope during a conclave. The title cardinal, in Latin cardinalis, which means chief or incardinated, originally referred to high clergy, bishops of surrounding dioceses, priests, and deacons were incardinated, which means permanently bound to the main churches within the city of Rome and its surroundings. They assisted the Roman bishop, the Pope, in performing liturgical tasks, and from the 8th century participated in his elections. In 1059, the right to elect the Pope was formally, exclusively assigned to the College of Cardinals. Other Christian centers did not have the rank of cardinal and elected patriarchs at episcopal councils. There are also archbishops. Distinctive belief centers that were established after the Great Schism, the more correct term, not during ecumenical councils, are purgatory, filioque, celibacy for priests, immaculate conception, sale of indulgence, which may mention papal infallibility, papal authority, etc. This is a more precise term because filioque was actually accepted a little earlier, before 1054, and also celibacy of priests, but they were not accepted in the Catholic Universal Church. After the Great Schism of 1054, the institutional unity of the Catholic Church ceased to exist. The unified Church split into two distinct branches, the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Orthodox Church in the east. The schism did not extinguish the Church of Christ. It just shattered the visible communion and administrative structure of the early unified Church. Technically, no single denomination can claim to be fully successor of the original church structure, because neither side holds all five patriarchies of the pentarchy. The analogy for this is like a federal state breaking apart, similar to the dissolution of the USSR and Yugoslavia. It formally no longer exists as a single unified entity. Crucially, the early church was not centralized like a country with one capital city. It was a network of five co-equal centers. Therefore, it will be even more difficult for any side to claim that that side is identical to the Catholic Church that existed in the first millennium. But however, both Rome and the Orthodox Church assert that their side remained faithful to the core of the early church while accusing the other of deviating from it. Here on this map we can see jurisdictions of five patriarchies in the 565 AD. Here is the jurisdiction of Rome, here is the jurisdiction of Constantinople, here is the jurisdiction of Antioch, which later expanded towards the Middle East over here, jurisdiction of Jerusalem, and jurisdiction of Alexandria. The split between two sides was caused by a combination of theological, political, and cultural factors that had been building up for centuries, which were filioque, papal authority, language barrier, shift in political loyalty by Rome, and few more. The breaking point occurred when Cardinal Humbert, representing the Pope, placed a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia. In response, Patriarch Michael Serularius excommunicated papal legates. The Roman Catholic Church grounds the Pope's authority in theological and historical arguments primarily from the Gospel of Matthew. This includes interpreting Matthew chapter 16 verse 18 as establishing Peter as the church leader and viewing the keys of the kingdom from Matthew chapter 16 verse 19 as symbolizing authority. The concept of apostolic succession holds that Peter's authority transferred to the bishops of Rome. Binding and loosing in Matthew chapter 16 verse 19 is seen as authority in matters of doctrine and discipline. In this part Jesus says to Peter, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." However, in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18, Jesus extended this authority to all of his disciples, not just Peter. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." While the New Testament was originally written in Greek, the Roman Catholic Church relies on the Latin Vulgate, translated by Saint Jerome in the 4th century. Latin was the language of law. The terms legare, which means to bind, and solvere, to loose, were interpreted through the lens of Roman law, emphasizing the Pope's power to create binding laws and provide dispensations for the entire Church, and God following those laws. Before this, there were attempts at earlier translations, but they were very poorly done and often contradicted each other. This translation altered how the Peter's authority was perceived. In the original Koine Greek text for both verses, Matthew chapter 16 verse 19 and Matthew chapter 18 verse 18, the words are written in a form called the periphrastic future perfect passive. The phrases used are estai dedemenon, which means shall have been bound, which is basically to be in a state of having already been bound, and estai lelumenon, which means shall have been loosed, which is to be in a state of having already been loosed. This suggests that the apostles, including Peter, were not originating new laws, but were conveying what had already been ordained by God. Their role was to faithfully transmit Christ's teachings to the ends of the earth. They functioned as messengers rather than legislators. And this happened. Apostle Peter spread Jesus' words from Jerusalem to Antioch and Rome. Apostle Andrew spread to Greece, Scythia, which is modern day Ukraine and Russia, and Byzantium, which is Turkey. James the Greater spread Jesus' teachings to Jerusalem and Spain. Apostle Philip spread Jesus' teachings to North Africa. Bartholomew spread to Armenia, India, Ethiopia. Apostle Thomas Didymus spread to India and Parthia, and etc. Since he said this to all the apostles, and because of the verses that will soon mention about the pillars, agreement, wrong teaching, and the community, we can conclude that if this is not only the authority to spread the teaching, but also the authority to receive the grace of the Holy Spirit during that teaching, all the apostles and later all the successors of the apostles have this possibility, not just Peter, which means that the authority is in all the bishops and ecumenical assembly, and not in one bishop or apostle. In the original Greek text of Matthew chapter 16 verse 18, there is a significant linguistic distinction between two words for rock. Kago desilego otisi Petros και επί ταύτητη Petra ikomodeso mutin ecclesian. Petros is a masculine noun meaning a small stone, or a pebble, or a stone that can easily be moved or thrown. And Petra in this sentence is a feminine noun meaning a massive rock, or cliff, or boulder, or rocky foundation. The Roman Catholic Church argues that Jesus likely spoke Aramaic, where the word for both is the same, Kepha. But it is highly probable that Jesus was multilingual. Growing up in Galilee, near major Hellenistic cities like Seraphrosis, he would have used Greek as a common language for trade and communication, and that there is a strong historical possibility that Jesus spoke Greek in certain contexts, such as in Galilee or when speaking to Gentiles. If Jesus spoke the words in Matthew in Greek, then the distinction between Petros and Petra was intentional and immediate. This will mean that he explicitly did not call Peter the foundation of the whole church. The fact that apostles choose to write the Gospels in Greek proves that they intended the message to be understood through precise nuances of the Greek language, including the distinction between Peter and the rock. Even though Greek was the global language, in Latin lingua franca, if the Gospel writers had intended to identify Peter and the rock as the exact same thing, they could have easily used the same word twice or phrased the sentence differently to avoid the distinction between Petros and Petra. And if we question the writers of the Gospel and the message of the Scriptures, then we question the grace of the Holy Spirit during the writings of the Gospel, and we question the divine will and the accuracy of the Lord's words, which is absurd in every possible sense, especially if we then claim that we are the ones who know the true divine interpretation and meaning. When Saint Jerome translated the Old Testament directly from the Hebrew instead of the Greek Septuagint at the end of the 4th century, it met with resistance not only in the East but also among Western fathers like Saint Augustine. The rest of the Christian world took the Septuagint as divinely inspired, so they saw the Latin Vulgate, which differed from the original Greek text in certain parts, as less authoritative or even suspicious. No, this is about the Old Testament though. However, The Vulgate, both Old and New Testament, was never officially accepted at the seven ecumenical councils. At these councils, the authoritative texts were exclusively in the Greek language. The Old Testament was read according to the Septuagint, and the New Testament from the original Greek manuscripts. Latin translations were considered local versions for the Western Christians, not a universal standard for the entire Church. The Council of Trent, that occurred in 1546 AD, declared that Vulgate to be the authentic and official text, but this is an exclusively Roman Catholic council, held after the Great Schism. Other churches do not recognize this council as ecumenical, uh, and they do not recognize this council at all, and therefore its decisions on the Vulgate are not valid. Augustine himself admitted in his Confessions that in his youth he avoided the Greek language and never mastered it. He was not an expert in Greek philology and used the Greek language only occasionally as a comparison. His theology of the descent of the Holy Spirit, from which the Filioque arose, is deeply rooted in the specificities of the Latin language. For example, the Latin verb proceder, which means to proceed, has a broader meaning than the Greek word exprogrestai. While the Greek term denotes emanation from the ultimate cause, which for the Greek is only the Father, the Latin term could describe any emanation, which made it easy for Augustine to include the Son. Augustine built on the foundations of previous Latin fathers such as Tertullian and Saint Hilary of Poitiers, who already used Latin terms that emphasize the unity of essence of the Father and the Son. To understand what Jesus meant by the rock, we must look closely at the original Greek version of Matthew chapter 16, verse 13 to 17. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." No, was not revealed. In the original Greek, the verb used is apocalypsen. This clearly emphasizes that Peter is a passive recipient of information. He was not the author of the truth. It was unveiled to him. The phrase, "the God, the living," in the Greek text uses a double article, oios to teu to zontos, which emphasizes the specificity and absolute nature of the truth that Peter is merely stating. And the phrase, "the flesh and blood," highlights that human authority deserves no credit for this realization. It reinforces the idea that the source of the message is divine, not human. Based on Matthew chapter 16, verse 13 to 17, the keys are the divine truth that Jesus is the Messiah, and the faith required to recognize him, rather than the person of Peter himself or his personal authority as a lawmaker. The true immovable foundation of the church is Christ alone, with Peter serving only as the messenger of the truth. 4 verses later, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 22 to 23. No, before I read this, I will just read Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, so we can have the full context. From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples that he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." This passage clearly shows that Peter as a human being is fallible and capable of making mistakes despite the blessing he received earlier. No, this was not a Peter statement about science or politics or a mistake in his way of life, but a direct attempt to change God's will and destiny. And right after that, he got this answer. In his own writing, Peter identifies Jesus as the living stone and the precious cornerstone. He refers to himself and other believers merely as living stones who are part of the spiritual house, proving that Peter did not view himself as the foundational rock of the church. He also quotes Psalm 118 and Isaiah to prove that Jesus is the rock. The first epistle of Peter, chapter 2, verse 4 to 8. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, "See, I lay down a stone on Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame." Now, to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who don't believe, the stone that builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble and the rock that makes them fail. After reading this, and soon more verses that speak to this topic, let us note that the Roman Catholic Church claims that Jesus literally meant the stone in the sense of Peter's tomb, and that this justifies Rome being the foundation of the Church. Anthropological research has shown that the bones belong to a man of strong build, aged between 60 and 70 years at the time of his death. The skeleton is missing its feet. Scientists believe that this is historically logical because the Christians who took Peter down from the cross probably just cut his ankles to free him more quickly, because Peter was crucified upside down. Pope Paul VI officially announced in 1968 that the bones had been identified in a way that we consider convincing. The suspicion is that the bones believed to be Peter's were not found in the original underground tomb itself, which was empty, but in the Wall G, in marble niche, where they were apparently later moved. There is no archaeological evidence of continuity of burial. The bones could have been moved in the Middle Ages for protection from the barbarians, or simply mixed up by mistake during Constantine's great construction of the basilica in the 4th century. During the excavations under St. Peter's Basilica, which lasted from 1939 to 1949, access was very strictly controlled and limited almost exclusively to the Vatican. Since the excavations were initially led by priests and not professional archaeologists, the scientific community has directed harsh criticism to the Vatican. The only evidence of identity, besides the location of the expensive fabric, is a simple graffiti on the wall in Greek, which says Petros Ani, which means Peter is here. This is considered to be weak evidence because it could only be a monument in memory of Peter and not necessarily the place where his body was. Also, in Roman catacombs, it was common to write Peter inscriptions regardless of whether the body was present. Although the analysis matches the description of Peter, a man aged from 16 to 17, there is no scientific evidence that the bones belonged to him. There has been no DNA analysis to confirm their Middle Eastern origin. The bones have not been carbon dated to date them to the 1st century AD. Only about 50% of the skeleton has been found, excluding the feet, suggesting that the remains may have been lost during the move. In 2024, carbon dating was used to analyze tunics traditionally attributed to St. Peter and St. John, revealing that they are actually from a later period. Regardless, Rome claims that these bones are those of St. Peter, and that this means that Rome has complete authority. Even if Peter was buried here, this is a literal interpretation of Christ's words and ignoring other verses from the Holy Scriptures. So judge for yourselves. We can also look at Revelation chapter 21 verse 14, where foundations of the church were mentioned. It says, "The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb." The text shows that there are 12 foundations, in plural, not just one. This proves that all 12 apostles are equal foundations of the church, and the city belongs to the Lamb, while the apostles serve as its collective foundation. We are built on the foundation of the apostles in Ephesians chapter 2 verse 20, not because they are the source of the truth, but because they laid the foundation by preaching Christ. Christ remains the chief cornerstone, who holds all the other foundation stones together. In Ephesians chapter 2 verse 20, it says, "Built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus Christ himself as the chief cornerstone." In Matthew chapter 18 verse 19, Jesus says, "Again, truly I tell you, that if two of you on earth should agree about any matter they may ask, it will come to pass for them from my Father who is in heaven." According to Deuteronomy chapter 19 verse 15, the rule is, one witness shall not rise against a man. At the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a matter be established. Jesus translates this legal principle into a commandment of God. For a decision to be valid before God, the agreement of several people is required. This prevents the arbitrariness of an individual. The Greek word that Jesus uses for to agree is symphonisosin. It is not just a technical agreement between two people, but a state in which their hearts and intentions are in harmony, like instruments in an orchestra before God. Roman Catholics also quote John chapter 21 verse 15 to 17. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Let's have a look at one more verse before we analyze, more precisely Matthew chapter 26 verse 69 to 75. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, And the servant girl came to him. She said, "You are also with Jesus of Galilee." But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you are talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again, with an oath, "I don't know that man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know that man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Peter's denial occurred during the Passion of Christ, while his restoration in John chapter 21 verse 15 to 17 took place after the resurrection. According to the Jewish tradition and legal understanding of that time, denying someone 3 times constituted total and formal severance of the relationship. By disowning Jesus 3 times, Peter effectively ceased to be his disciple. The fact that Peter denied Jesus 3 times with oaths and curses in Matthew chapter 26 verse 69 to 75 serves as the ultimate proof of his human fallibility. It shows that even the man called Peter could fail profoundly when relying on his own strength. Therefore, the authority of the Church cannot rest on his person, but only on the divine truth he later transmitted. This also explains why Jesus had to ask him, "Do you love me?" exactly 3 times after the resurrection. It was an act of healing and formal legal restoration to his office. Since Jesus received Peter back as his disciple, he assigned him his task as his disciple, which means that every disciple who Christ accepted had exactly that role, not just Peter. In first epistle of Peter, chapter 5, verse 4, Peter clarifies that Jesus is the only chief shepherd, meaning all human leaders are merely under shepherds and equals in their service. In Peter chapter 5, verse 4, he says, "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away." We will in the moment mention a few more verses from Peter. There is one more verse that Roman Catholics quote. It's Luke chapter 22 verse 31 to 32. Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." This verse is used as proof of Peter's role as the head of the church by Roman Catholics. But let's take a look at 2 more verses. In Luke chapter 22 verse 33, Peter said, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." In Matthew chapter 26 verse 33, Peter said, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." In those verses, Peter displays human overconfidence by claiming he is more faithful than the others. Jesus prays for Peter specifically because he was the one at the greatest risk of total apostasy. And we already know what happened to Peter, and that he renounced Christ with curses and oaths, even though he said he had a strong faith. Peter's task was not to rule over the others as a monarch, but to serve them by sharing the lessons of his own fallibility and repentance, and to be a witness of how much he had been forgiven. he owed the greatest debt of gratitude to God's mercy. Now let's go back to Peter's own words. In first epistle of Peter, chapter 2, verse 25, Peter said, "For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." And in first epistle of Peter, chapter 5, verse 1, Peter said, "To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed." In these verses, we clearly see that Peter calls Christ the chief shepherd and himself as equal with the other apostles, not as chief. Here are examples that show that Peter did not have supreme authority. A great conflict arose in the early church. Christians, who were formerly Jews, claimed that the Gentiles must be circumcised and obey the entire law of Moses in order to be saved. After Peter, Paul, and Barnabas have finished their presentation and gave their opinions, there was silence, and then the Apostle James spoke. In the Acts of the Apostles, we can see that, chapter 15, verse 13 and 19, when they finished, James spoke up. "Brothers," he said, "listen to me." And in verse 19, "It's my judgment, therefore, that we shall not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." This shows that authority was consecular and that Peter did not have the final word over the other apostles. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 11 to 14, Paul said, "When Cephas, Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he began to draw back and separated himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in the line with the truth in the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, 'You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile, and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs?' Paul, rebuking Peter to his face, shows that Peter was not considered infallible or superior. Peter's behavior gave a clear message to Christians that they should stay away from the Gentiles, and thus he showed a false teaching that was immediately rebuked. If he had supreme authority, Paul would not have been able to publicly condemn his behavior as not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. In Acts of the Apostles, chapter 8, verse 14, when the apostles in Jerusalem heard that Samaria had accepted the word of God, they sent Peter and John to Samaria. The apostles collectively sent Peter and John to Samaria. A person who is sent by a group is an agent of that group, not a supreme monarch over it. And probably the most important one is the Mark chapter 9, verse 35. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." Whenever the disciples argued about who was the greatest, Jesus never pointed to Peter. Instead, he emphasized service and humility, explicitly warning against the desire for a primary rank among them. We will later mention more parts of the Holy Scriptures when they are relevant. Now, We will focus on the history and structure of the church, as well as the events within it. The church in Jerusalem is the mother church. It was the first center of Christianity and was led by James, not Peter. This shows that Rome cannot claim to be the chronological or original source of church authority. This is the jurisdiction of Jerusalem. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, also known as the Church of the Resurrection of Christ, it is the holiest place for most Christians. Within its walls are two key places: Golgotha, the rock on which Jesus was crucified, and the Aedicola, a small chapel that houses the remains of the tomb where he was buried and resurrected. The first church was built by Emperor Constantine the Great around 335 AD, after his mother Jelena identified the location. Over the centuries, it was demolished several times by the Persians and Caliph al-Hakim and rebuilt its present appearance after the rebuilding in 1810. Historical evidence shows that Peter established the church in Antioch first. As we mentioned before, this is the jurisdiction of Antioch, and the cave church of St. Peter is located in a cave on Mount Staurin near present-day Antakya in Turkey, and it is considered one of the oldest churches in the world. Inside the cave, there is a tunnel that served the early Christians to secretly escape to the mountain in case of attack or persecution. And fun fact, this is the place where disciples were called Christians first, in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 11, verse 26. This undermines the Roman claim to exclusive authority. Peter was an itinerant apostle whose mission was to spread the gospel to many cities, proving that his role was to be a transmitter of the faith to the whole world, not to establish a centralized power in one specific location. Here is the chronological order of importance of the foundation of patriarchies. Patriarchy of Jerusalem, founded around 33 AD, as we mentioned a few times before, its first bishop being James the Righteous, gained status of patriarchy in 451 AD. Patriarchy of Antioch, founded around 34 to 37 AD by Peter. Patriarchy of Alexandria, founded around 42 to 49 AD by Mark. Patriarchy of Rome, founded around 42 to 67 AD by Peter and Paul, and Patriarchy of Constantinople, founded around 38 AD, according to tradition, by Saint Andrew, the first called apostle, gained status of patriarchy in 330 AD. The term first among equals, in Latin primus inter pares, means that while the Peter and later bishops of Rome held the highest prestige, he did not have the power to unilaterally rule over other patriarchies. All bishops possess the same sacramental authority. Saint Ignatius of Antioch was the third bishop of Antioch and a direct disciple of Saint John the Apostle. He was the first writer known to use the Greek term Catholicos to describe the whole Christian Church, emphasizing unity under the leadership of bishops. He was the first to emphasize a clear distinction between the three ranks: bishop, priest, and deacon. He believed that the bishop is the center of unity of each local church. He strongly defended the teaching that Eucharist was really the body and blood of Christ, fighting against heretics who claimed that Christ was only a spirit. Saint Ignatius wrote 7 famous letters while he was being transported under guard from Antioch to Rome to face martyrdom around 107 AD. Those being to the Ephesians, to the Magnesians, to the Trallians, to the Romans, to the Philadelphians, to the Smyrnians, and to Polycarp. Now we will have a look at Epistle to the Romans, more precisely salutation in chapter 4. In salutation, Ignatius writes, "To the church which also holds the presidency in the location of the country of the Romans, worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of blessing, worthy of praise, worthy of success, worthy of sanctification, and presiding in love, procatemenetes agapes, maintaining the love of Christ, and bearer of the Father's name." In chapter 4, "I do not, as Peter and Paul, issue commandments unto you. They were apostles. I am but a condemned man. They were free, while I am, even until now, a servant. But when I suffer, I shall be the freedman of Jesus, and shall rise again, emancipated in him. And now, being a prisoner, I learn not to desire anything worldly or vain." Now we first have a look at this part. In his epistle to the Romans, Saint Ignatius of Antioch grants the highest authority to the apostles, mentioning Peter and Paul. He states that he cannot issue commandments like they did, because they are apostles, while he is merely a condemned man. However, in his other writings, Ignatius consistently refers to the apostles in the plural, placing the same weight of authority on the entire apostolic college, and this was mentioned in Trallians, Magnesians, and Philadelphians. Through these references, it is clear that Ignatius did not isolate one apostle as the sole leader, but rather viewed the apostles collectively as the ultimate and unified source of divine word. He said that the apostles had greater authority than him, in the sense that they were direct disciples of Christ, and that he was only their disciple, that he alone could not say what shall be done. Now, let's talk about salutation in his epistle to the Romans and meaning of the phrase presiding in love. The Roman Catholic Church sees this as an evidence of jurisdictional primacy, Pope's legal authority over the whole Church, but the real meaning differs. Saint Ignatius of Antioch addressed the Church in Rome with such high honors primarily because of its unique status as Church of Martyrs. At that time, the Roman Christian community was renowned for its unwavering faith and its willingness to face supreme sacrifice under imperial persecution. By using the phrase presiding in love, Ignatius was acknowledging their leadership in suffering and charity. He wanted to encourage a community that had already been watered by the blood of the apostles Peter and Paul. This points out that his language is one of profound humility and liturgical praise, rather than a legal definition of papal supremacy or infallibility. If he had wanted to emphasize the authority of Peter or Rome in particular, he would have used words that denote supreme power, rank, or authority. In his letter to the Philadelphians, chapter 8, verse 2, he emphasized that the inviolable foundation archives for him are Jesus Christ, his cross, death, and resurrection. In some parts of his letters, the terms breaking the bread, Eucharist, and agape are used almost interchangeably to describe the same reality, that being the local church gathered around Christ. Ignatius writes in his letter to the Smyrnians, chapter 8, verse 2, "It is not permitted to baptize before the bishop, nor to hold an agape, low feast." Also, in his letter to Smyrnians, Ignatius writes, "Where the bishop is, there let people be, and where Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." From this, we can conclude that for Ignatius, every local church is fully autonomous and complete in its internal structure. Therefore, if someone wants to mention his epistle, let him mention all his epistles and the whole context, and in addition to this, all the other facts we have given. The Roman Catholic Church often takes as an argument for its authority over other churches the fact that it intervened several times in request cases when there were disputes in early years. For example, Clement of Rome intervened in Corinth. His intervention, known as the First Epistle of Clement, was sent around 96 AD to resolve a church conflict where a group of believers had deposed the legitimately appointed elders. For this case, Clement wrote as a brother and a witness to the tradition, urging them to return to the old order established by the apostles. The letter is written in a tone of humility and concern. The author uses pronoun we rather than I. Clement believes that the order established by the apostles is of divine origin and must not be violated. At the beginning of the letter, chapter 1, verse 1, Clement apologizes that the Roman Church did not respond sooner to the problems in Corinth, due to sudden and successive troubles. That was probably because of the persecution of Emperor Domitian. This suggests that Corinth was seeking advice or help from Rome. In that period, end of the 1st century, the function of the bishop in Rome was still closely related to the Council of Elders. Clement writes as the spokesman or secretary of the Roman community. The interventions of the Roman Church in early disputes were seen as moral arbitration, not legal supremacy. Because Rome was the capital of the empire and remained orthodox during many Eastern heresies, other churches sought its advice as a faithful transmitter of apostolic tradition. Rome functioned as a court of appeal because of its prestige and faithfulness to the gospel, not because the Pope was seen as a monarch over other patriarchs. Rome was seen as a big brother among brothers. And this is not the last time we will mention this phrase, court of appeal.